Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Rereading the News, a quarterly conversation series created by Afro Charities and for today presented in partnership with the Afro American newspapers. My name is Amber Campbell Wheeler, Executive Assistant at Afro Charities, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. Rereading the News brings the Afro archives to life. Each program often begins with the historic Afro article and opens the door for intergenerational conversations with scholars, storytellers, and community voices. Together, we look at the past to better understand our present and imagine new futures for our communities. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our collaborators who make this work possible. The Afro, my colleagues at Afro Charities, our moderator and former Afro journalist Sean Yos, and our featured guest, historian and author Emily Lieb, whose new book, Road to Nowhere: How a Highway Map Wrecked West Baltimore, inspired today's discussion. I also want to thank the Afro's Jay Jackson for doing the work behind the scenes of today's program. This is our final Rereading the News program of the year, and what a year it's been. We kicked off winter 2025 with Lonesome Hearts, a live conversation hosted at Stem and Vine with Nicole Hill from the Ancestors Were Messy podcast. In the spring, we partnered with the Lily Carroll Jackson Museum for Mother of the Movement, exploring Jackson's activism and legacy as a mother. We were joined by the museum's director and Dr. Jackson's great granddaughter, Lisa Mitchell Sinar. And this summer, we gathered at the Baltimore Book Festival with Ariane Edmonds, Shan Wallace, and our executive director, Savannah Woods, for Black families in the press, examining their families' historical ties to the Black press. We're so excited to close out this year with today's discussion on Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere. That 1.39-mile stretch of US 40 was carved through West Baltimore in the 1970s, cutting neighborhoods in half for a highway that was never finished. The scars remain, and so do the questions about what comes next. The Afro has documented the construction and destruction of this highway from start and continues to chronicle its lasting impact on the community. Last year, author Emily Lieb submitted a research request through Afro Charities while gathering materials for her forthcoming book, Road to Nowhere: How a Highway Map Wrecked West Baltimore. Since then, we've stayed in contact and joined forces to create a program that not only revisits the history of the highway, but also illustrates how archival research informs scholarship. Today, West Baltimore native and veteran journalist Sean Yos sits down with Emily Lieb to discuss how this project transformed neighborhoods and lives, and what its legacy could mean for the future of Baltimore. Before we get started, a quick reminder. No matter where you're tuning in from, whether that's YouTube, Instagram, or LinkedIn, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll be taking a few toward the end of the conversation. And if you have an idea for a rereading the news program, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@afrocharities.org or send us a DM on Instagram. Now let's get started. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Sean Yos.
Amber, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. And Emily, thank you for sitting down for this conversation about this subject that is so personally close to my heart, actually. Why don't you tell us first, how did you come to be interested, or how did you find out about Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere? Because we know that there are highways to nowhere all over the country, but how did you find out about Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere?
Yeah, it's a great question and kind of a long story. But thank you so much for chatting with me, and thanks to the Afro Charities for
Of
having me
course.
here. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So really, this is how I came to this story is a story about archives and how wonderful archives are and how serendipitous they can be. I am not from Baltimore. I grew up in Pennsylvania mostly, and I was getting my PhD in history at Columbia in New York City. And I was thinking of doing, I don't know what, a project that was not this. And I came to Baltimore to do research in the Baltimore City Archives. And I just happened upon a box of photos, like black and white photos, of houses in what I now know were houses in the Rosemont neighborhood in West Baltimore, that were, that were falling apart. Windows were broken. The awnings were sort of falling down. And I knew enough about Baltimore at that point to know that these were not old houses. These pictures were taken it emerges in 1969 and 1970 by the City Department of Housing and Community Development. And I knew they weren't old houses, and I knew they were good houses, and I knew that I looked, at a map, and I knew that this was a relatively new neighborhood in West Baltimore. And so I wondered what, what was I looking at, right? Why were these newish, very good, very solid houses that people had obviously lived in and loved? Why were they falling apart in these pictures? What was I looking at? And so really this book is an answer to that question of, what was I looking at in these pictures? What happened to these houses? What happened to the people who lived in them? And what was the story here? And this book is an answer to that question, going back in time really to the beginning of the 20th century and extending past, a little bit past the moment in which those pictures were taken.
Well, I did a film, for those who don't know. I made a short film about the highway to nowhere called Disruption, Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere. And I've been plunged into, the circumstances connected to it for a few years. But last year I produced 4 films, so I had gotten my mind away from all of that, the devastation caused by the highway, until I read your book. And it brought me all back into it in a kind of in a deeper way, because you're so precise and specific and detailed about the stories that you tell. The book is beautifully written.
Oh, thank you so much.
There it is on the screen, The Road to Nowhere. I was fascinated off of the break reading how Mary went from the Sugar Hill community of Jacksonville to Rosemount.
Yep.
How did you? That was so serendipitous, or was?
I know.
How did you?
Yes, absolutely serendipitous. I mean, the thing that is really extraordinary, this, listeners probably know this, because the thing that people know, if people know anything about the Road to Nowhere, the Highway to Nowhere in West Baltimore, they know how powerful and strong that community was, and how that community mobilized to stop the road from being built. I sort of argue that in some ways the city, in some ways that the destruction was the map itself caused the destruction, not the fact of the road. But we'll get there in a second. But yeah, so it just happened that that Mary Rosemond, who was a resident of Rosemont, had saved. She was a person. She was really active in the Neighborhood Improvement Association. She was really active in the community. She was also somebody who filed everything and saved it. God bless her. And so it happened that, almost all of her papers are now at the University of Baltimore's Langsdale Library in the Baltimore Studies archives. And so I knew about her. And then there was an article about her in the Sun. And then when she died, there was an obituary also in the Sun. And they just mentioned that she had come from Jacksonville. And in one of those articles, I think in an interview with her, she mentioned that her mom, there's a great quote about, they tried to take my house in Jacksonville, but my mama wouldn't sell. And this all happened in the late 1940s, when the state and federal governments did not yet have the power to just take your house if they wanted it. Her mother could have said, she had the ability to say no and stick with it. And that house in Jacksonville is still standing. The highway runs right next to it, but her house in Jacksonville is still standing. And it really just is extraordinarily fortunate that we're able to say, I think the first line of the book is something like the age of the American Expressway started and ended in the same place, in Mary Rosemond's backyard. And that really just is a coincidence. Although, as you noted, this story, or versions of this story, happened in so many other cities that, it's likely that the folks who were in Rosemont and who were in Harlem Park and other parts of West Baltimore came from other places in which were also menaced by expressways that maybe were or weren't built. So it just happened that Mary Rosemond had all these papers and had given these really beautiful interviews and had made that connection for me. But it was just a very a happy, not happy, a terrible, but a coincidence. Happy for me, terrible for the cities.
Amazing coincidence that she went from
Yeah.
one community that was devastated by a federally funded project to
Yep.
another great
Yep.
community that was devastated by a federally funded project. I've
Yep.
got 9 million questions. Let's think about map versus the actual highway. You talk about the power of the map in your book, but I want to bring you back to the father of American urban renewal, Robert Moses. And a few years back, I found out that he was hired as a consultant in Baltimore
Yep.
in the planning of the highway to nowhere. And apparently Moses literally, they were asking him, well, how do we do this? Where do we? And apparently Moses put his finger on a map and just brazenly just ran it down the map and says, this is what you do. So when you talk about the power of the map, that's the ideas emanate from that map, and those ideas wind up literally cutting communities in half. Talk about the power of the map and utilizing the map to devastate amazing communities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yes, for sure, as in so many stories, a very early villain here is Robert Moses, who, yes, I'm pointing at what is in the direction to me, but not to any of the listeners. I'm just gonna wave my arm. Yeah, you're right. In 1940, the city of Baltimore hired Robert Moses's planning firm and if anybody is interested, there's a great Bob Caro wrote a wonderful book about Robert Moses that explains how this all worked in New York City.
Yes.
And he essentially drew, exactly as you say, a line across. So what he was trying to map at that time was called the East-West Expressway. And I'll just call it, for the purposes of this whole conversation, the East-West Expressway, even though it changed names 1,000 times, just to keep us unconfused. And he sort of drew, exactly as you say, drew a line down Franklin and Mulberry streets in out from downtown west. And yeah, Robert Moses, to him, the cities were for cars, cities were for moving through, cities were for when I talk about Robert Moses, a sort of interesting anecdote about him was when in New York, he himself did not drive. But he often he had a plane that would fly him over New York, and that's how he sort of made his plans there. So when he pictured a city, he pictured it from the sky looking down, right? So he wasn't thinking about a city as street life and people. He was thinking about the things you can see from the sky, not the things you can see from the ground. His thought was, listen, there had been plan for a street railway down Franklin and Mulberry. The plans for destruction had already started to undermine that part of the community in old West Baltimore. And so he sort of thought, okay, well, and he said, he told an interviewer that the things that we will need to destroy are of no loss to Baltimore. The city will be better off if they're gone, which of course is a lie, right?
Let's give some context. Let's give some context to that callousness. I mean, Moses was I don't know if self-proclaimed, but he was called the father of Negro removal. He coined that phrase, apparently, or people connected him, coined that phrase. And he was known to be a virulent racist. So that gives some important context to how he operated. So go ahead.
Right. That's great. That is really sort of a crucial piece of this story, because the map that he drew, because at the time in 1940, in the early 1940s, when he was mapping, Rosemont in West Baltimore was a white community. And so the map he drew, and the first couple of maps that followed his map, the East-West Expressway went east-west through Old West Baltimore and then turned south and went out of town down, right? Through Black neighborhoods in that direction. They did not go the way that the road ultimately ended up going, right? They went across and down. And what changed is in 1956, there's a federal law, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which offered cities across the country essentially free money to build expressways. And by that time, Rosemont, in the early 1950s, Rosemont had become, thanks to, I argue, the actions of the school board, in many respects, Rosemont had then become, it was a Black middle class homeowners neighborhood. And instantly, right, to your point, the maps that used to go all the way, or avoid it, go down, the highway maps changed and turn up and do like what you see here on the cover of the book, right? Turns up, and this is the route that people are familiar with now. That was the plan, to eviscerate a Black community, because whereas before it had not been eviscerated, because before it was not a Black community. So in 1953 it really became a Black community very quickly, and then in 1957 the city says, oh, this is not Robert Moses anymore, but building on his original plans, the city says, oh, hey, let's run this road through it. And to your point, whether or not Robert Moses was personally involved in drawing these maps or not, in cities across the country, he was in many cases, and in many cases he wasn't. But the way he thought about what cities were, the way he thought about who cities were for and who they should serve, that lingered, and I would argue in many cases still lingers today, right? This incredibly, it's sort of white supremacist planning that does not value, as I said, right, the people, the metaphor of him looking down on a city from an airplane, I think is really useful here, does not value who is on the ground, can't even see them, doesn't even acknowledge them, right? Except insofar as he said, in many different ways, eggs to be broken, right? You can't put a highway through a city without breaking some eggs, and these are the easiest eggs to break, was his
I start my film with a quote from him where he says, I can't remember the exact quote, but he says he raises his stein to the person who can make an omelet without breaking eggs, or something to that effect.
Yeah. And I mean, it really is, it is true. Robert Moses is correct insofar as, if you are going to, and this was a problem that cities had nationwide, right? If you are going to build an expressway through a city that already exists, then you are going to have to bulldoze some part of that city, right? And so a question is, then a reasonable, well, in my opinion, a reasonable person might ask, so why are we doing this, right? But and the way that he, as you say, right, the way that he answered that question reflexively is, essentially find Black people, find some poor people, find Latino communities in some cities, right, and carve it like that is, as he said, like, is no loss to the city. So he thinks an expressway is better for the city than the people who lived underneath it, right, or the people who were in the way on these maps. And he's right that you have to, if you're going to build an urban highway, you got to put it somewhere. So that's one question that we should ask is, okay, so then should we be doing this at all? But then number two, the way that he answered the question of, okay, so then where, is steered by this kind of white supremacist notion of planning and who matters in a city and who doesn't.
You make the crux for me is, there was from his perspective, there's no loss when you go through communities.
Yeah.
And so for me as a storyteller who has been focused on this highway to nowhere, the thing that I wanted to show was, if you destroy something, it doesn't matter if there's no value attached to that thing, right?
Of course. Mm-hmm.
But what was destroyed in the building of the highway to nowhere, this community that we call Old West Baltimore, had tremendous value. Mm-hmm. And I want to give you an example of what one of the things that I've done in the past few years is I've mentored some high school kids, in one school in particular, the community school in Remington. I took them on a field trip to West Baltimore, and I take them to that overpass that looks down the highway to nowhere, so they could physically see how this community was literally cut in half. like literally cut in half, right?
Hmm.
And so then I asked them the question at what point I tried to steer them in the direction of understanding what this community was, what it represented, who was
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
So to give them an understanding of why this matters now. And so let's talk a little bit about this vanguard Black community that existed in West Baltimore, in Old West Baltimore.
Hmm.
Um, uh, you want to speak on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure. So one of the things that turned out to be, and I alluded to this earlier, that surprised me in my research. When I started, I had no idea of how important schools, public schools, were to the story of the community, the Rosemont community, and other parts of Old West Baltimore, but Rosemont in particular. And the thing is, as listeners know, Baltimore is a southern city. Baltimore had Jim Crow schools, which meant that Baltimore had legally segregated schools for Black students and for white students. And one of the things, as reader or listeners know, Baltimore was a real pioneer in lots of different ways to try to segregate communities. Right? We had the residential segregation ordinance. We have restrictive covenants. We have all these tools that were used nationwide, but started here. But in Baltimore, I argue the first step in that process of trying to establish residential segregated neighborhoods, and the most enduring was the schools.
And that was a
So
question that I was going to ask you, like
yeah,
how the link between the use of the Board of Commissioners and then in order to that the link between that and the segregation ordinance in 1911, the first one in the United States.
yeah.
So you're reading my mind. You go
Yeah.
ahead. Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Well, one of the interesting thing is, so in the early part of the 20th century, the school commissioner, whose name escapes me right now, but it's in the book, he was a guy from Denver, strangely,
Mm.
came here. And so he was, his perspective. So the law was that, the way that the law worked is that the, new schools were built for white students. And then Black students got very few hand-me-down, the oldest, the most crumbling schools, and they were sort of clustered near downtown. As the Black population in the city grew and the schools obviously stayed the same size, what the Board of School Commissioners would do is they would convert schools that had served white students into serving to serving Black students. And there were huge fights about this every time he said, we're going to convert this school. The white neighbors, lost their minds, even though, it was not that they didn't have Black neighbors. They did. And they were, I'm sure some of them were monstrously cruel to their Black neighbors. I'm sure that some of them were perfectly nice, right? But it wasn't the fact of the Black neighbors that was the problem. It was, for them, what made them revolt, what made them start to throw bombs, what made them start to just act out in incredibly violent ways, was the idea that their neighborhood was now branded a Black neighborhood by the presence of a Black school, even though, again, the neighbors were the same. Right. It's not like people, it was just describing who the neighbors were. So one of the things that happened in the late, well, so anyway, what happened in 1911, the reason why the city started to try to segregate its neighborhoods more, what it thought, more permanently or more persuasively with these residential segregation ordinances, was that some folks in the city thought that the guy who ran the schools, the Denver guy, was like too wishy-washy, right? And he wasn't holding the line enough. He was converting too many schools. So, okay, we're gonna like leave the schools as a tool for segregating communities, but we're also going to try these series of residential segregation ordinances. Then, when the Supreme Court says in 1917 you can't do that, then they sort of returned to the schools again as the tool for, again, trying to segregate neighborhoods. Then, restrictive covenants, other tools come and go, but the consistent one really is using schools as a tool, because people will not often live where their kids can't easily get to school, right?
Of course.
So it's not like you couldn't live in in what the neighborhood that became Rosemont, if you were Black in 1921, you could. I don't think it would have been a particularly pleasant experience, but you could. But your kids would have to go all the way back downtown to go to school. So, that's sort of the way that so I think a lot of people think historically and think currently too that the reason our schools were and are segregated is because our neighborhoods are segregated. But in my argument is it's the opposite. At least in Baltimore, the opposite is true, right? Neighborhoods are segregated because of the schools that were segregated. That was very deliberate. That was a choice. And so what happened in the early 1950s, because schools in Old West Baltimore for Black students were getting more crowded, were getting more rundown, because the NAACP was starting to file lawsuits and win in federal courts about the constitutionality of the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal standard, because there was no argument that they were certainly separate schools. They were certainly not equal schools. The city started to convert those schools out west of Fulton Avenue to serving Black students. And that is what drew the middle class people who had the means to leave the older parts of West Baltimore, came out into the neighborhood that would become Rosemont and other parts of West Baltimore as well. And possibly East Baltimore. I don't know the first thing about East Baltimore. It's like, maybe it was in East Baltimore, it was upside down. I don't know. But that is what enabled the birth of the community that would become known as Rosemont. And it got its name from these Black pioneers who moved out there in the early 1950s and established a neighborhood association that was named for the streets that they lived on, and Rosemont is sort of a portmanteau. So that's how the neighborhood got its name.
Well, to affirm the strength of segregation in Baltimore, most of us in West Baltimore know nothing about East Baltimore either.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, jump in the comments if everything was in fact backwards in East Baltimore.
Let's take a question from Instagram. Savannah in Public, what was the impetus for building this road? What problem was it trying to solve?
That's a very good question. So the people who wanted the road built, these expressways built. So number one, starting in 1956, when this federal money, they're often called 10-cent dollars from the federal government, because cities had to pay 10% of the cost of building expressways, and the federal government covered. So it's basically free, right? And so part of the reason is, one of the reasons the law was passed was that, it was sort of a civil defense act. So the idea was we have to build expressways. This is the 50s. Remember, this is the Cold War. So one of the reasons why policymakers thought they needed to build urban expressways was to provide a way for people to leave a city quickly in case, the Russians dropped the bomb on them, which seems like you didn't think that went all the way through, because maybe you wouldn't, not necessarily material. But so that was one reason. The people the sort of boosters of Baltimore, people all men, who owned downtown property, who owned department stores downtown, who owned banks downtown, wanted to build these roads as a way to number one, make Baltimore sort of a modern city, right? You don't want Wilmington to have all these federal dollars and build all these nice highways, and you didn't take it, and now you're a backwater, right? They wanted to make it easier for people who were moving out to the suburbs, white people moving out to the suburbs, to get back into downtown, to sweep into downtown on these highways, to go to the theater, to go shopping, to go to work. Their traffic was bad. There is when you read their complaints about in the 50s, they're trying to defend why they want to build these expressways. And they are talking about, the 20th century traffic on 18th century roads. It is true, I think, that traffic was bad coming in and out of town. So the rationale for building these expressways is to make it easier to get from out of town to downtown, and to sort of slide right through, or sort of whiz right through the part of the city that's the city, right? Where people live, where people go to school, where people work, where people communities are. Just that is something that is completely sort of immaterial to the advocates of these roads, because they care about their property downtown, and they care about where they live in the suburbs, and they care about getting from one place to another quickly and efficiently. And then another thing that they cared about was people talked a lot in the 50s and 60s about something called urban renewal, which was a series of federal programs that were aimed at, as you know, in the name, right, renewing cities. And what that meant was, you know, that's sort of an extension of this Robert Moses way of thinking about cities. What that meant is clearing what people called blight, which, you know, was sort of a description of an aesthetic but really was a description of like where Black people are. And so again, the idea that, you know, these great ribbons of concrete would be better for the city and for the metropolitan region than the people who lived and worked and went to school in these communities that got obliterated. So there was a justification for, you know, the problem that the road was trying to solve was separate in some ways from like, let's clear this neighborhood out. And also sort of, you can't be understood without that, thinking about that impulse. Again, going back to this question of what are cities for, who matters and who doesn't, who can we see, who can planners see, and who can they not see. But I will concede, I do think that's probably true that traffic was bad. I will concede.
Sure. Now, I mean, we can put some numbers and some real kind of substance to what happened as a result of this highway to nowhere that wound up being stopped after, I think it's almost 1.5 miles.
No, mine, yeah.
Dozens of Black-owned businesses wiped out. I believe more than 900 Black families were displaced. You know, these are real people that we're talking about, even though Moses only could see them from thousands of feet or however he was traveling over these areas. Let's take another question from Only Smart Caden. Okay. Despite the expressway idea being disregarded in today's conversation of urban planning in marginalized environments, do you see a new project being made that can have a positive impact to the city? What are your thoughts about that?
I would love to hear your thoughts too, but that's a really, really good question, because I think a danger, and I think in defense is strong. To give some credit to Robert Moses' way of thinking about cities, he also believed that cities needed great projects in order to be great, right? So in New York, for example, he built Lincoln Center for the performing arts, which sits on this. That was an urban renewal project. That was a neighborhood. That was a neighborhood where people lived, mostly Puerto Rican families, lived, worked, went to school in the neighborhood that became Lincoln Center.
He built the UN too, as well,
yeah,
right?
And the UN, yeah. So and same deal, right? Like this was a neighborhood, now it is the UN. I think that this is a really good and important question to think about, because I think there is a danger of looking at this history and saying we shouldn't do monumental things in cities because of the cost, and the costs are truly enormous. But I think, you know, does that mean that we shouldn't do anything? Like this can, you know, when we're building things in cities, people are there, communities are there. So we need to think about if these, like what we really gain when we do monumental kinds of projects like that, monumental construction projects like that, what we lose, how to be, you know, the words fair and just come up a lot in my book, because they were words that, you know, policymakers often used to mean nothing, right? Like what is fair, that, you know, they just decide what's fair and then tell you and you have to take it. So really thinking about what is just, what is fair, what is, you know, what we should keep. So I'm hesitant to say that, you know, okay, well then we just can't build big things in cities anymore. I'm not a planner. I'm a historian. So, but I think to really learn the lessons of this history, you know, okay, we need to value different things. Cities are for people. Cities are for the people who live in them. Cities are for the people who will live in them in the future. Cities are not for cars. Cities are not for highways. Cities are not for, I mean, these kinds of monumental projects that are not for the people who live in them, right? So that's a very good question. I do not know the answer, but I think it's a worthwhile question to keep asking: is how we can do great things in great cities without destroying what makes the city great. This is a hard question, but
Well,
it is super important.
to that point, I mean, if you any type of monumental project, any type of big project, for lack of a better term, that would disrupt neighborhoods, people are going to get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be people who disagree, who don't want it. There's always going to be. So what
Mm-hmm.
has to happen, and I'm not a city planner either, but ultimately what has to happen is there has to be buy-in from a community.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be conversations with community that are ongoing and that are substantive, that are
Mm-hmm.
meaningful, so that
Yeah.
there's an understanding and community buy into what's actually happening.
Yeah,
What happened
exactly.
during the era of Moses and urban renewal, there was none of that. They just
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
came in
absolutely.
with the wrecking ball
Yep.
and destroyed and took what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there are lessons to be learned from what has happened, that's, I think, the biggest one. You have
Yeah.
to have buy-in, or at least significant buy-in from legitimate members of the communities that are being disrupted, because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately that's what's happening.
Yeah. And
Um,
I think the word you use there, taken, is that is the word, but that is the key, right? Because the thing about the story of Rosemont is that even though the expressway was not completed, the expressway that was meant to eviscerate Rosemont and then leave the city through the park, that name I talk in the book about the three swindles that sort of that are the answer to the question to, where we started, like what happened to these houses in these pictures. The answer to me is that is these three swindles, and the amount of money and the amount of wealth that was taken out of this community that had wealth and money and had houses, just robbed and then robbed again and then robbed a third time. These tiny little houses generated so much money for people who were not their owners, for people who did not live in the community, for people who did not see any of that. Like, this was an incredibly lucrative project over this, span of from the 50s to the 70s, an incredibly lucrative project for let's be real, for rich white people who didn't live in Baltimore at all. And so, the sort of notion of, if we're going to extract, like, we cannot have projects that are extractive. We have to have projects that are additive. And you're exactly right. I think the way that we get there is to ask people what they need, ask people what they want, and do our planning alongside communities, and not, as you say, just like dumping a plan on people or drawing a line on the map and washing your hands of it.
invading communities,
Yeah,
because
exactly
ultimately
right.
that's
Exactly right.
we have a comment from MSM is here. This history is rich. My grandparents lived off Edmondson Avenue. I can remember when the houses were there and then they weren't.
Hmm.
And that is the plight of these communities in a nutshell.
Yeah.
They you know.
Just and again, I mean, these were, as I was talking earlier about the sort of the rhetoric around the concept of blight, right? The thing that I think is really important to understand here is that blight is not something that happens, right? Blight is something that powerful people impose on, invade and impose and create, and then point to and say, well, a road would be better for a community than, or, for the city than this, again, quote unquote, blight. The thing that is so important to remember, again, not a justification. It doesn't matter if your roof is falling in, you still deserve to have your house not be bulldozed, right? But the thing that is crucially important to think about when we're thinking about Rosemont in particular, that's what I know most about, is that this was a middle class, like, stuffy neighborhood. People were, really thought way too much about their lawns, and their, this was a functionally a suburban community. And like, so you have this beautiful neighborhood one day, and then exactly as you say, right, as your memories of your grandparents' house, like then it's just gone. And it's gone because this map, even though there is no expressway, the map had such power to create the kind of like, well, now it's just gone, and what happened. And I think to understand in a really granular way what happened, I think helps us to understand like what we see when we look around, and understand that things just don't just happen. Everything that we see in a city is a result of a choice that somebody made, and so we can make different choices.
In a minute, I want to go to the origins, the actual origins, go back to the origins of the highway, where it was built and where it was stopped in Fells Point and Barbara Mikulski in a minute. But before we get there, we have a question from me, actually, from Savannah in public. Have you been following current conversations about redesigning Route 40? If so, can you share how that project is progressing, how you're thinking about it? That's a great question. There was a very vigorous effort by the city in partnership with the federal government, and specifically congressional members from Maryland, the Maryland delegations, Kwesi Mfume, Senator Van Hollen, and other members of the Maryland delegation, as well as city leaders and state leaders. There were many millions of dollars that came in as a result of the Biden infrastructure project. And they built something called West Baltimore United, which had a series of conversations with community members in an effort, allegedly, to have them have direct input, as we just were discussing, direct input on what happens now with these communities. What do we do? How do we spend this money? And unfortunately, a lot of the energy that was present earlier for this type of activity has sort of waned. Actually, I was working on an expansion of my film connected to some of these activities that has been in limbo because of various reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But the bottom line is, forget about me. The bottom line is that we have to keep the pressure on politicians and leaders to have community be at the forefront, to be in the middle of these decisions that are made about what happens to this community, because this community was devastated. And then when you look at the actual highway, the structure, that concrete, that slathered, poured in concrete, it's a mess to put, and for it to just stop in the middle of nowhere, literally, it's just a metaphorical slap in the face. So to answer the question, I don't know what's happening with it now. I don't know where the process is, and most importantly, I don't know how much input the community is going to have going forward in the plans to revitalize that area. So, another question for you, Emily: how did your research and your writing of this book shift, expand, disrupt the way you move through the world, your worldview? What are your personal takeaways from it?
That's a really good question, and a big, huge question. I am a person who, I was for a long time a history professor, and I taught urban studies and urban history. And the thing that I always wanted my students to take out of my classes, and when I teach now, when I lecture to students now, the thing I want what I want to shift is just how we ask questions, right? So to understand that the cities that we have, as I said, I think before, are the cities that we've built, right? So if we're walking down the street here in Baltimore, walking down the street in Seattle, where I live, and anywhere, right? To understand that what's there is not what is, right? And it's not what was, and it's not just sort of something that like it sprang up, right? It's a, you know, I always talk to students about not using the passive voice in writing, and the reason for that is when we turn a verb into an adjective, we obscure the action and we obscure the actors, right? So to say that something was destroyed is not the same thing as to say somebody destroyed this community, right? And so just being able to ask, so I think, you know, part what my research did in part is to help me to ask better questions when I'm in cities that I don't know anything about. I see, we're gonna maybe talk a little bit about New Orleans in a second. You know, in places I'm not familiar with, but I know there's a story there, right? And what I would love people here today to take away from this is that remembering that there are always stories, there are always histories, there is always a reason for the things that we are, the sort of built environments that we live in, you know, November 7th, 2025. And we might not know what that history is. We might not know what that story is. Somebody might know, somebody might not know, but we can ask better questions. And so I hope this process has made me a better asker of questions. It has certainly made me a big pain in the butt to drive around with. Nobody likes to drive in a car. Nobody likes to drive in a car with me. And you know, particularly when I'm, you know, we're in urban highways, I'm a real unpleasant companion. But so yeah, I hope, you know, what I hope has shifted is being more, asking better questions and being more attuned to the very real costs, like literal costs on the ground of money, of the unjust ways in which we have approached to date planning and building and changing our cities. And it has made me very interested in doing, again, I'm a historian, not a planner, but I again a nuisance about like let's use what we learned and do better in the future. So I hope I ask better questions at the very least.
There's a question here from hello Louise Griffin. Is it possible for the city to work with the local community to reprogram this area? There were similar efforts made in New Orleans at underpasses that destroyed people of color's communities. And it goes back to the beginning statement. This has happened in dozens of communities. I remember I lived in Detroit for a period, and I met a man who I was helping him with an autobiography. And he told me the story of what happened in Detroit. It was so similar to what happened in Baltimore. And what I found out, it happened in Chicago, it happened in Miami, it happened in Los Angeles, I believe. So literally dozens of communities, prominent Black communities across the United States, were devastated by these federally funded highway projects. So for me, the root of this question is, can there be some synergy between some of these communities as we go forward in the reparation and repair of these communities?
That's a really great point. I think that's, yeah. Can we, this is the national story. Can we make the reparation also a national story? That's a really amazing point, a really amazing question. And as you say, you know, some cities were able to take the Reconnecting Communities money from Joe Biden, and I think Rochester, they succeeded in taking down an expressway. In lots of cities, there were plans to reconnect communities that were torn apart by this kind of infrastructure. And in Baltimore's case, right, in some cases in Baltimore, we do have the highways. In some, like in Rosemont, there isn't a highway, but there is still incredible harm that the map caused. And so thinking about not just, you know, how can people in Rosemont and people in Harlem Park come together and think about, you know, reparations, but also, yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, how could people in Baltimore and people in New Orleans and people in Detroit, people in LA, like, how can they think together about, the specifics are different, but the thrust of the problem is so common.
And we can speak specifically also about dollar amounts. I mean, when we talk about repair, people have to see the word reparation has become so loaded because people are afraid. Well, I'll say white people are afraid that means writing a check for Black people. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. However, when you talk about repair, that's a real thing because something has been destroyed. It should be repaired. And part of that repair shouldn't be just a physical repair, but maybe investment. And that means finances. That means money. That means resources. So those conversations have to happen, and perhaps there's more power in those conversations when there is connection between communities that have been devastated, as opposed to operating in a silo. So I think
I think that's a really good point.
A question from UB Blake Center. So what do the developers get for garnering community buy-in if there are no consequences if they don't? Great question.
Great question. Great question.
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer. Yeah. I mean, a thing that this is not an answer to the question. That's a fantastic question. I think there is something that as I live in Seattle now, and in Seattle, we're having a lot of conversations around zoning, changing our zoning. We are a primarily single family zoned city. And so from the Seattle context, I get kind of like hives when we talk about like letting communities plan for themselves, because in Seattle, how that is playing out is single family zone communities, rich people who own their houses, who live there now, are doing everything they can to keep anybody else from coming in and sharing their neighborhood, right? And so I think we need to be thinking, and I don't know how to do this either, but I think we need to be thinking not just about current communities, but also the future of communities, right? How can we build neighborhoods and cities that work not just for the people who live there now and like are trying to pull the ladder up, which is happening in Seattle and some other cities too, but how we can build, neighborhoods that people want to live in and can live in. And that does not mean gentrifying them. That means building, welcoming communities that lots of different kinds of people can live in and thrive in. And so like not just thinking about who is there now, but also thinking about who can be there in the future and how we can make that work for everybody. Another thing I'm a real pain in the butt about is Seattle zoning. Don't the end on that conversation.
We have about 8 minutes left. Emily, so talk a little bit about what your tour with this book. Like, where are you going? What do you want communities? What do you want people to take away from this book that you've written? And again, it's wonderfully written and very specific and incredibly well researched. So,
Thank you.
What do you want people to, as you go forward and talk to people traveling around the country, what do you hope for people to get and to understand after reading your book?
I want people to understand that I think the general outlines of this story are nothing about this is in general news, right? I think most people, everyone certainly here, most people know that the way that urban renewal infrastructure projects, especially expressways, were built at mid-century that was racist planning. It was destructive planning. It destroyed cities. It had consequences that we still live with today. What I think is important about this book and what I hope people in Baltimore and outside of Baltimore take from it is that, as you say, it is possible to actually learn who was robbed from, who got their wealth plundered, what that, I wasn't able to, for some limitations of archives, I wasn't able to calculate exactly, I can't tell you exactly what this family or that family lost, but I can come pretty close. And so I think in this conversation about what our people owed, that we can say we can learn, with historical research, with archival research, this information is out there. We can tell this story in a very specific way, in a very human way, in a way that makes communities that are in some cases plowed under, in other cases sort of harmed in other ways, even if they still do exist. We can tell their stories that is more than just a story of, I'm like whizzing past this neighborhood on a highway and I look out the window and, as the commenter said, and my grandmother's house is gone, and that just is what it is. Like, we can tell the story of why that is, and we can name the harms that were caused, and we can do that using materials that are still available in city archives, in archives like the Afro's archive. Right, we have this information, we can get it, we can tell these stories better, and when we do, hopefully we can enable people to fight back now, and hopefully, I mean, in my opinion, to get back some of what they lost. But that's another yeah. And to answer your first question, so I hope that folks come out tomorrow, the 8th, at the Pratt Library downtown. I'm pointing again. Means nothing to anybody. At the Pratt Library downtown, I will be having a conversation with the editor of the Baltimore Beat, Lisa Snowden-McCrae, which will be great. And then on Wednesday night, if you happen to be Wilmington folks, Philadelphia folks, I will be at the Delaware Historical Society in Wilmington. I think it's 6, and we will be talking about this book, and also how some of these things played out in Wilmington. If you are New England folks, I will be in Providence, Rhode Island, I think, next Saturday, and then I will be and on Sunday. And if you're DC, in Tacoma Park at People's Book, I'll be there on this Sunday, the 9th, and then in Seattle on the 20th. So I hope that you will come out and join me and talk a little bit more about this if you're in any of those places. And if you are not in those places and would like to have a conversation about this, then get in touch with me and I will make it happen.
Point of personal privilege for myself, real quick. One of my films that I produced last year will be at the Maryland Film Festival on tomorrow at the Parkway Theater at 2:00. It's called Relentless, and it's a short film about the remarkable artist Joyce J. Scott, who is a native and still lives in Sandtown, one of the communities that was devastated by the highway to nowhere. So if you have time tomorrow to come through to the Maryland Film Festival, come check out Relentless. I'll be there in the big theater at the Parkway Theater at 2:00 tomorrow. So.
And everyone should. What your film about your film disruption is so good. So if people haven't seen the film that you made about the highway to nowhere, they should watch that, because it's terrific.
Thank you. Amber, you want to jump in?
Yes, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for coming out and for partnering with Afro Charities. Before I give my spiel for closeout, I just want to ask, what is something interesting that you both have learned from the Afro archives that you would like to share very briefly?
Oh my God.
You go first.
I've been in the archives for decades. It's one of the greatest sources of Black history, Black life, Black culture in the world, American Black life, history, and culture in the world. And that's not an exaggeration. I used to ask, when I was a reporter, I stayed in the archives. I won an award for one of my stories because of the archives. It was because I was up there researching Strom Thurmond and his Black family. And we had all the stories in archives. It was a known thing. His connection, that he had Black members of his family. It was an open secret. And the archives had all the stories from South Carolina all the way to New Jersey. Seriously, archives is everything.
Everything. And I would also like to plug not the Afro, and also, this is the reason why we need to be fighting to preserve local journalism. I could not have written this book without the Afro. I could not have written this book without the Sun. There were issues with the Sun's reporting at mid-century, but the Sun and the Afro had reporters on the ground in Harlem Park, in Rosemont, talking to people. The reason I'm able to have people's voices in this book is because they talked to reporters, and reporters printed what they said. And so I don't know how people who are writing histories of 2025 are going to do it without that kind of, real local journalism that we used to have and we are losing. And I think like a plea to somehow get back really great local journalism is how we are, exactly as you say, it's how we're able to tell the stories of today, but it also is how we're able to write good histories that are legible and make sense to people and that are connected to their experiences today. That is what journalism does. And I think we have to get it back.
I absolutely agree. Again, we've hit our 1 o'clock mark. This has been a riveting conversation. Emily, thank you for joining
Thank you
us.
so much for
Sean,
having
thank you for
me.
joining us.
Thank you.
Everybody, please make sure if you're available to have the conversation with Emily in person tomorrow at the
Come.
Eva Press Century Library from 3 to 4. Check out Sean's documentary next week. Also, stay connected to us. You can visit our website. You can donate to Mrs. Santa. Make sure the kids get some uniforms. And thank you again for spending your afternoon with us. Have a wonderful Friday night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.